The manager's voice clipped across the dining room. "You're done out now." Grace folded her apron into a small, defiant rectangle and walked into the rain. Across town, Charles Whitmore smiled at a city he thought he owned. The next morning, an envelope landed on his mahogany desk with no return address. The lawyer's letter inside was calm, precise, and impossible to ignore. "This is a notice." One signature, one court date, everything Charles had paid for suddenly had a price. Before diving into this gripping tale, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch more inspiring stories like this one. The rain had a way of changing the city, like a slow hand erasing hard edges. Outside, lights blurred into long strokes of color, amber street lamps, neon, the glass fronts of buildings that made the whole avenue look like a painting left in the wash. Inside the restaurant, the rain's rhythm turned softer, a steady score under the low hum of conversation and the clink of cutlery. Servers moved in practiced arcs between tables, carrying plates that steamed against the cool air from the open door. The room smelled of roasted garlic, citrus, and the faint, honest tang of dish soap. It was a place that felt expensive without trying to shout it. Grace wiped a table near the window until it gleamed, though the light made the grain look like veins. Her hands were small and quick. The knuckles on her right hand had a pale crescent where a ring had once rubbed against her skin. She worked here 3 nights a week and at a bakery on weekend mornings. She thought of the bakery when she smelled yeast and thought of her mother when she passed a woman with a gray scarf, the way the woman tucked it with the same neat, practiced movement. Memory came in small, sharp images: an unpaid bill, a child's laugh over a cheap cereal, a lullaby hummed off-key. Grace carried those images gently, like fragile dishes. From an outside, colder angle, the restaurant was a machine built to polish wealth. Its owner liked his name on brass plaques and in magazine pages. He lent the building an air of authority. A tall man who wore his money like a suit, who had installed chandeliers that cost more than some people's apartments. Patrons came not merely to eat, but to be seen in the light his places made. Staff learned the rules quickly: smile, anticipate, never cross the line that existed somewhere between respect and fear. Grace had learned them too, but she also knew where rules bent and where they broke people. Grace moved through the dining room with a practiced smile and the precise economy of someone who had learned to save energy for what mattered. Tonight, her steps felt heavier than usual, not from tired muscles, but from a small, persistent worry lodged under her ribs. A notice from a landlord had come that morning, an increase modest on paper, devastating in practice. She had calculated numbers on the back of a receipt and found a small, ugly gap between what she could make and what she would owe. She kept the figures to herself like a secret that might shame her if spoken. Pride was a poor substitute for rent money. A table in the corner held a man with a presence that made conversations around him soften. He did not need to raise his voice. The language of wealth carried in other ways: small gestures, a server's quick deference, the way a room rearranged itself to accommodate his silence. The man looked at the city through the window and at the rain streaking like glass tears. He had the careful composure of someone who rarely had to rush. Grace had learned to notice patrons like him. He tipped according to an inner scale that had nothing to do with kindness. She refilled water glasses, memorized orders, smoothed napkins until they sat like quiet pledges. The clock above the bar ticked with indifferent accuracy. Grace thought of her son. No, not all her days allowed the luxury of thinking of him without also checking a balance or a schedule. She kept a photograph folded in her wallet, a small face with a gap-toothed grin. It fit there like proof that she had, in some private way, outrun despair. The chef called her name just loud enough for her to hear. There was a look in his eyes that meant trouble, a shift in the kitchen that made staff breathe a little differently. The restaurant's hierarchy worked the way tides do, sometimes calm, sometimes a rush that tugged everything out of place. Grace wiped her hands on her apron and headed into the storm of the kitchen, where heat and steam blurred edges and made the world close and intimate. She loved the kitchen's honest noise. It kept bigger fears at bay because it demanded attention in the present. A regular at the bar laughed too loudly at something a friend had said. Two young women compared coats. At a table near the entrance, a man talked quietly into his phone, voice low but urgent. His words were a private storm Grace could not see. Outside, the city moved. Inside, the restaurant held its breath as if expecting something. Grace felt like that, too, ready for the next thing, whatever shape it would take. There was a kindness in the way she folded linens, in the way she handed over a plate with a gesture that said, without words, "This is for you." It was a small dignity, one that could be swallowed by a single careless comment from someone with power. She had seen that before. The flicker of a patron's annoyance turned into a manager's demand, the way someone could be made small when it suited another's comfort. Those moments left a residue. Tonight, the residue sat like a shadow at the back of her throat. An impartial voice would note that every place has a moment when its rules are tested, when the soft edicts that keep the wheels turning meet human friction. In restaurants, that friction often happens at the edges, between desire and duty, between tip and trust. For Grace, the friction was not theoretical. It was the rub of a daybook with numbers that did not add, the coldness of a landlord's letter, and the steady insistence of a son who expected dinner on time. She smoothed one last napkin and stepped back into the dining room as the rain eased and a pale streetlight carved a new shape on the pavement. Something in the air smelled of change, electric and honest, and Grace, who had learned to hold small certainties tight, felt the first gentle loosening of them. The bell over the door chimed like a small, polite alarm. It cut across the room the way a bright note can cut through a chord, and every head turned. Grace felt it in her shoulders before she looked up, an old reflex, one born from being the first to answer when the world insisted. Through the rain-smeared glass, a figure slipped into the restaurant with the quiet surety of those who move through rooms a lot. He wore a coat that did not need to keep him warm. It was a coat that kept the world in place around him. When he took the table in the corner, the air around him seemed to smooth itself, as if conversation bent to fit his presence. Empathetic voice? Grace watched him because she had learned to watch for the small tells. How a man set his wallet down, whether his hands met in a relaxed way, whether he scanned the room like someone choosing a painting. There was something in the set of his jaw that made her think of old money portraits, steady, unhurried, but with edges that might cut if you touched them. Her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with the fragile balance she carried every night. Tonight, her worries had been counting bills. Now they shifted, a new shape that moved toward her without making a sound. Impartial voice? The man was Charles Whitmore, though the name had not yet been whispered across the dining room. Charles had spent years building a small empire of restaurants and buildings, signing leases that inflated the value of blocks and asking favors that later turned into headlines. He had the practiced calm of someone who had learned to have his way and to confuse the way with right. Staff recognized him by habit, by a tilt of his chin, by a manner of asking for things that made the asking seem reasonable even when it was not. When powerful people checked a place, the staff felt it was like a shift in gravity. Empathetic voice. Grace refilled his water with the gentle steadiness of someone trying to be invisible and helpful at the same time. She moved close enough to hear the low tones of his conversation, a voice that loved the inside of its own sentence. He asked for simple things, extra bread, a side of lemon that shouldn't have mattered. He gave instructions that others would have called preferences. He watched the room the way someone reads a map, and Grace felt, as she often did when the wealthy sat nearby, a small hazard. The rules were different when he was at a table. She smoothed a napkin she had already smoothed twice and told herself to be small and precise. Impartial voice? A thing happens often enough in places of service that it becomes a pattern. When a person of consequence decides to judge, the judgment lands like a law. Managers learn that protecting the patron is the easiest way to keep their jobs. Employees learn the positions that will let them keep paying for the next week and the next rent increase. Those positions include the willingness to erode one's own dignity if the price for dignity is survival. Grace understood this chain. She had walked it before and had tested its thinness. Empathetic voice. The night crept along in its routine until a careless sound, an errant plate, the scrape of a chair, opened like a small door. At a middle table, a young man laughed too loud. At the bar, a woman reached for her phone and dropped it. It hit the floor with a hollow, ashamed sound. Charles looked up. His eyes found a teenager near the entrance, a boy with a backpack and a way of standing that read differently when wealth decided to look. The boy's skin was darker than most here. He had come in with a group, not to dine, but to wait for a parent. One of them had smiled at a joke. It was nothing, but Charles moved like someone who found small things intolerable. Impartial voice. The manager at that moment slid into view. Oliver, a man whose loyalty had long since learned the direction of wind. He was the sort who could translate a wealthy customer's upset into company policy and who knew the exact tone to make the staff feel apologetic when the customer was displeased. Oliver had been promoted because he could extinguish flames before they touched the chandeliers. He had also been promoted because he understood the economics of fear. It was cheaper to fire than to argue. Empathetic voice. Grace saw Oliver's jaw set before he spoke. She had never been the kind to step forward without reason, but she had a reflex that belonged more to the person who had to stand in front of her son when bills piled like menacing shadows, an instinct to protect the small and embarrassed. When Charles's voice slanted in a way that turned a private laugh into a public wrong, Oliver's words were quick and sharp. "Excuse me," Oliver said, and the room felt as if it had been dipped underwater for a second. Impartial voice. The conversation that followed was short and fierce. Charles summoned indignation with the ease of a conjurer. Oliver obliged with a reprimand that smelled faintly of policy and more strongly of panic. Grace, who had been refilling a glass, found herself caught between the desire to make the moment pass and the urge not to let a frightened teen be flattened by a man who traded in presence. She opened her mouth to defuse, to offer a small kindness, a tray of bread, a smile meant to restore calm, but the words that came out were sharper than she intended. "Sir, he didn't mean—" Empathetic voice. That sentence broke like glass. Grace watched the change happen in Oliver's face, a flicker of something like calculation. Charles turned his head slowly to look at her, and for the first time his eyes narrowed in a way that felt personal. He asked her a question that was gentle only in form. "Did you say something, miss?" The room held its breath. Grace's mouth was suddenly dry. She thought of Ethan's face folded in her wallet and straightened her back, because the truth had a way of needing a voice. Impartial voice. Words were said. The exact phrases became a splinter that would later be pulled and examined. In the moment, the outcome was swift. Oliver told Grace she could leave. He said, talking back as if it were a crime, as if tone were a law. He said it with the practiced ease of a man who knew that speed ended debate. Grace's tip jar clinked behind her like a small accusation. The regulars whispered, silverware chimed. Outside, the rain had stopped and left the pavement shining like a promise. Inside, the restaurant had split along an invisible seam. Empathetic voice. Grace gathered her things with hands that did not tremble until she reached the door. The city air hit her like cold truth. She walked into it with a certainty that something had shifted. Not merely her job, but the sense that the world around her could be turned on its axis by a look. She would carry the sting of it with her, because the place where the world pressed down often left marks that took longer to fade than the burn itself. The thought that struck her then was small and steady. Someone in that room had chosen to make her the face of a problem, and they had done it without asking what the problem truly was. There was a softness to Grace that came from having to be gentle with her own small hopes. She kept her voice low even when she laughed. She moved as if not to wake something fragile. After the firing, she walked 2 blocks to a bus stop and sat with her hands folded over her purse, feeling the city buzz around her like an indifferent ocean. She thought of Ethan and the oatmeal she would not be able to buy this week if she missed shifts. She thought of the landlord's letter, of the numbers she had penciled on a napkin and folded into the back of her wallet. She replayed Oliver's words in her head, not because the firing surprised her, but because of the suddenness, how easily a life could be folded up and put into a cardboard box. Grace told herself small truths out loud to steady the tremor in her chest. It's a job. I'll find another. The sentence was both comfort and command. She had learned to believe in verbs, work, save, move, because they were things she could do. Her pride tugged at her too. She had been a server long enough to know the thin line between dignity and desperation. She closed her eyes and let the city sounds press against them. A horn, a laugh, the far scrape of a delivery truck. Each noise pressed her closer to a decision she had not yet named. Across town, in his glossy office, Charles Whitmore watched footage from that night on a tablet, slow and meticulous. He watched Grace's face the way someone studies a photograph for detail. It was not malice that made him pause, but curiosity with a hard edge. In his memory, his life had been a series of careful bets that turned into holdings, into names that people said when they wanted to sound certain. He liked to control the way others liked coffee. Control was warm and steady in his hands. An impartial view would note the logic in Charles's mind. A public scene could be smoothed over, turned into a narrative that made the house look good and the staff efficient. The right response erased friction and kept the brand spotless. Yet, beneath the logic was habit. Charles had learned to measure people by the usefulness of their stories. If a problem could be shaped to serve his interests, then it was not a problem so much as material. That habit had guided deals and dismissals alike. Back at her small apartment, Grace dialed a number she tried not to use often. "Hi, it's me," she said when the line picked up. "They fired me tonight." Oliver said I was talking back. The voice on the other end belonged to Laura, a coworker who had been a friend for the last 2 years. Laura's reply was swift, practical, and edged with worry. "That man at the corner table, right? Charles Whitmore?" Grace confirmed. Laura hesitated and then added, "Oliver won't stand against him. He never does." The two women fell into a conversation that felt like stitching. Small, necessary repairs to a frayed life. Laura had her own quiet fear. She worked double shifts and went to night classes because she wanted a future that did not depend on anyone's mood. Her friendship with Grace was easy because both of them carried the same tired hopes. When Laura said, "You need a lawyer, Grace," the words landed like a small gift. Grace tucked the idea into her chest like a seed. Possible, not yet certain. Oliver sat across his desk in a manager's office that smelled faintly of cologne and lemon cleanser. He felt the relief of having acted fast. In his mind, speed had the shape of safety. If you moved first and decisively, you cut off debate and protected the line between customer and company. He cared about that line because his mortgage depended on it and because his promotion had come from the same people who now nodded at decisions kept swift and clean. When he told himself the firing was necessary, his voice sounded like the person he wanted to be, efficient, unemotional, decisive. But Oliver carried small contradictions. He had owed favors to Charles in the past, an early loan for a renovation, a quiet recommendation that led to a bump up the ladder. Those favors sat like little stones in his pocket. He had learned that gratitude sometimes felt like ownership. He did not like to think of himself as owned, but there were nights he felt the weight of those little debts and wondered if they would ever be repaid. Grace called Ethan and listened to his small chatter about a drawing he had made at school. His voice steadied her. "Mom, did you get fired?" he asked, blunt and worried. Grace answered slowly, cushioning the truth. "They asked me to leave, Ethan. But I'll be okay. I promise." She did not want to tell him about the landlord or the math. She wanted to protect him from the tilt of her life. Mothers make promises like that because sometimes the promise is the thing that holds. Empathy shows how tiny mercies become armors. Grace began to list possibilities: bakeries hiring, a temp agency, a morning shift at a diner. She felt the nervous excitement that comes when plans start to form, a spark of agency. Yet, under that spark was exhaustion, the long work and the constant accounting that left her with little time to grieve or plan beyond the immediate. In the small neighborhood bar the next day, A quiet man in a suit spoke to Charles in a voice low and certain. They discussed leases and openings, and the name of the restaurant came up like a coin in a hand, an asset to be adjusted. The man mentioned an increase in rents on the block, a pressure that would make smaller tenants leave. It was casual talk for men who reshaped streets with papers and signatures. The impartial voice notices patterns. A brand keeps its value by pruning what is not fit. The empathy voice notices faces. Grace's name might not have been spoken yet, but her life was there, in a ledger somewhere under numbers and lines. At home, Grace made a list with a pen that kept sliding across the page. She wrote, lawyer, friend, temp job. She circled the word lawyer twice. The word felt big and expensive, but it also felt like a door. The idea of legal recourse gave her a new posture, one that did not only react, but asked questions. What if the firing was not only a matter of policy? What if it was a warning to others or a favor turned into punishment? The tension coiled between them. Oliver's need to protect his position, Charles's quiet appetite for order, Grace's stubborn insistence that she would not be reduced to silence. Each of them stood on different sides of a small and breaking world. The next moves would not only test their motives, but reveal which of them were willing to betray what they once called loyalty. Grace kept the idea of a lawyer folded like a clean napkin in her mind, smoothing it when worry wrinkled her thoughts. The next afternoon, she met Laura at a small cafe that smelled of espresso and sugar, a place between the bus route and the bakery where Grace sometimes picked up morning rolls. Laura arrived with her hair tucked into a cap and a grin that tried too hard to look easy. They sat by the window, the light coming in like a promise that did not feel steady. Empathetic voice? Grace watched Laura stir her coffee, the way someone watches a familiar face to see if it still belongs to them. They had shared late shifts, swapped fragments of home-cooked meals, and traded life, hacks the way two sailors trade maps. Grace believed in loyalty the way she believed in the weight of a penny in her palm, small but true. She began the conversation with cautious hope. "I'm thinking of getting a lawyer," she said, watching Laura for the kind of shock that would mean help. Laura looked down, then up, her eyes trying to find a place that would not betray her. "That could be good," she said, "but you have to be careful." The words should have been ordinary. Instead, they landed with a coldness that made Grace's stomach flip. "Careful of what?" Grace asked, impartial voice. Laura's face tightened for a beat that was almost invisible. She had debts that sat beneath her like cold stones, student loans, a brother's hospital visit last winter, the small catastrophes that kept her awake. Survival had taught her to make choices that felt like bargains with fate. When power offers a hand, the hand looks like help. She had been cornered before by promises wrapped as favors, and she had learned how easy it was for one promise to change everything. Empathetic voice? Grace watched Laura slide her palm across the tabletop as if smoothing a memory into place. The friendship between them had lived in small things. An extra slice of cake, a borrowed apron, a shared cigarette outside the back entrance when the night cooled. "Laura," Grace said softly, "you know me. Would you? Did you see what happened? Would you?" Her words thinned out. She needed proof of care, a sign that what she had felt that night mattered to someone who understood the cost. Laura's phone buzzed then, a small, bright interruption. She glanced down, and the color that came into her face was not relief, but something like calculation. She stood, said she had to use the restroom, and left her bag on the chair as if she would be right back. Grace watched the door close and, in a moment of small weakness, picked up the phone that lay on the table. It was an impulse born of a worry that felt like hunger. She told herself it was to check a message she had sent. The screen unlocked under her thumb as easily as a confession. Impartial voice? What Grace saw, there was a picture that would respin her reality. A string of messages between Laura and a contact saved as C. Whitmore flashed across the screen. Short messages, polite and efficient. Tip came through. "Good job. Meeting tomorrow. Payment sent." Below those, a timestamp and a notification from a banking app showed a small transfer, enough to soften bills, not nearly enough to solve everything, but enough to change someone's choice that night. Empathetic voice. The world narrowed to a few compressed seconds. Grace's heart beat loud in her ears, a drum that did not match the coffee shop's quiet. She felt the cold rise in her palms and the slow, heavy ache of betrayal. She had laughed with Laura about cheap wine and split shifts. They had promised to cover each other's shifts when life tilted, and here in the plain light, a hand she had held turned out to have fingers that could be bought. Images stacked. Laura's hesitation at the bus stop talk, the way she had avoided Oliver's look the night Grace was fired, her words about being careful. It all folded into a sharp, terrible pattern. Grace put the phone back, where she found it with the care of someone returning a sacred thing. When Laura returned, smiling as if nothing had happened, Grace met that smile and felt it crack like porcelain. "Who were you meeting?" she asked before she could hold the question back. Laura's eyes flicked to the bag and then away, and for a breath, she looked young and small. Impartial voice. Confrontation has a way of asking more than one person is ready to answer. Laura's face moved through registers, defensiveness, shame, then a practical kind of fear. She could have lied. She did not. They wanted information, she said, finally, her voice thin. Charles wanted to know if the staff would cause trouble. He asked about loyalty. I told him what I'd seen. The admission came like a small surrender. Empathetic voice. Grace felt as if someone had pried open the place where she kept her small certainties. The word loyalty tasted of iron. The sting of the betrayal was not only that Laura had chosen money over friendship, but that she had helped turn the machinery of power against them. "You took money?" Grace asked because it had to be said. Laura nodded like a child caught with a hand in a jar. "It was supposed to be small," she whispered. "I needed it. I didn't think." Impartial voice. The choice made by Laura was understandable in the world's harsher ledger. A small transfer could mean a saved bill, a postponed crisis. Yet the moral cost was real. For Grace's lawyer, the news complicated everything. A friend's testimony was now suspect, a witness could be discredited, the narrative could be shaped by those with resources. Grace's path to justice shifted. It no longer ran in a straight line. Secrets like that one split into legal strategy and human wreckage. Empathetic voice. Grace sat very still for a long moment, feeling the room tilt. She thought of Ethan's grin in the folded photo and of the list in her kitchen drawer. Lawyer, temp job, friend. The circle around lawyer felt both necessary and suddenly lonelier. Laura reached out as if to close the distance, but Grace drew back. "Why?" she asked, not for evidence but for tenderness. Laura's apology was small and plain, but it did not close the wound. In the silence that followed, the betrayal settled between them like dust that would not be wiped away easily. Impartial voice? With this revelation, the case was no longer only about a wrongful firing. It was about a system that turned humans into instruments and about how survival presses people into impossible decisions. Grace now faced a deeper fight, not only to reclaim a job or to expose an unfair dismissal, but to reconcile why loyalty had been priced and sold. The coming days would demand a sharper map, legal counsel, witnesses, and a strategy that could outmaneuver both money and mercies sold under strain. Grace put the phone down and listened to the small apartment settle around her like an audience holding its breath. Outside, a truck idled and then moved away. The radiator clicked in a tired rhythm. The list on her kitchen table looked suddenly fragile, an outline of a life she had been counting on staying whole. The word lawyer still sat circled twice, but now those circles felt less like a door and more like a spotlight. She could see the price in her mind's eye: consultation fees, filing costs, time away from possible shifts. Every step toward justice had a coin attached. Empathetic voice. The hardest part was keeping Ethan's mornings normal. He still expected pancakes on Saturday and a story at bedtime. He deserved those small anchors. Grace measured each choice against his small, earnest face in the photograph she carried. If she fought and lost, would they both lose more? If she did nothing, what would she teach him about standing up? The questions carved little hollows in her chest where certainty used to live. She lay awake and tested both answers as if they were stones, each heavy, each necessary to bear. Impartial voice, practical obstacles often shape moral decisions. Employment law costs money and time. Tribunals move slowly. A claimant without funds faces a long slog. Employers with resources can wait and wear down resistance. That asymmetry is a kind of leverage. Organizations hire consultants and lawyers who understand how to make small fights expensive. For many workers, the choice is strategic survival, not abstract righteousness. Empathetic voice. Grace went to a free legal clinic the next morning with a copy of the termination notice folded in her bag like an accusation. The room smelled of vinyl and coffee that had been on too long. An earnest young lawyer named Marcus listened without interrupting. He had a gentle way of laying out options, a forensic kindness that named risks and possibilities. "You have a case for unfair dismissal," he said, writing letters that looked like plans on a legal pad. "But evidence and witnesses will matter. We'll need to show that the reason given, talking back, is a pretext and that the manager acted under customer pressure." Grace nodded, and Marcus's words settled into her like tools. He asked about witnesses and proof. She thought of Laura and the messages, and, of course, she thought of Oliver's speed. Marcus suggested preserving receipts, texts, CCTV requests. His voice remained even, but Grace heard the quiet files closing in their volumes. "There are no guarantees," he added, "and it will take time." Empathetic voice. Time, for Grace, was a luxury that was already spent. The landlord's second notice arrived like a flatterer who would not be ignored, polite in words, sharp in meaning. "Please respond within 7 days," it read. She called and begged for a payment plan, and the landlord's patience was a ledger of his own needs. He offered a rental increase or the thin mercy of a late fee. Grace felt the walls narrow. Every sympathetic sentence from Marcus came with a practicality that pushed against her fever of principle. Impartial voice. Employers often exploit delays. A fired employee who must immediately find work to pay bills has weaker negotiating power. This pressure can create settlements that look like victories but are tiny in substance. Companies also use informal coercion, quick offers of small severance, the implied threat of a public character smear, or the hope of rehiring elsewhere under terms favorable to the employer. These tactics are efficient and legal in many places. Empathetic voice. Grace grappled with the idea of a quick settlement. The thought of a single check felt like oxygen, but she also felt something like a moral ledger: accept small money and risk the story disappearing, or press for principle and risk losing shelter. She walked the neighborhood and watched people who seemed to have every choice. She let herself imagine a future in which she told Ethan she had stood up and won. It buoyed her like a small, dangerous tide. Impartial voice. Meanwhile, inside the restaurant's glass tower, calculations were being made in suits and on tablets. Charles Whitmore had his own advisors, people who measured reputation like a balance sheet. A complaint could be absorbed, rebranded, or quietly settled. His circle preferred solutions that kept headlines small and assets intact. Oliver, facing his own precarious place between the boardroom and the kitchen, felt the pressure tighten. His promotions sat on a shelf that could be dusted away if he misstepped. He began to make calls, an attempt at containment that read like strategy. Empathetic voice. Laura's confession had shifted Grace's trust into a flat, cold place. She had not expected her friend to betray her for a transfer that might have seemed necessary in another life. Still, Grace thought of Laura's face when she apologized, small, ashamed, and wondered if anger would open wider wounds than it healed. She did not know whether to confront Laura publicly, to forgive privately, or to use Laura's messages as evidence and sever the friendship. The choices felt like a test, not only of resources, but of heart. Impartial voice. Complicating matters, rumors began to circulate. A social media post, unnamed but suggestive, hinted that a staff member had been rude to a patron. The restaurant's PR moved quickly, seeding a narrative that painted the firing as a regrettable but necessary action. In modern disputes, perception shifts faster than facts, and perception can be decisive. Grace watched the rumor curve through feeds like a small animal, and she felt the cold of being seen badly without having had a chance to speak. Empathetic voice, the pressure did something unexpected and human. It sharpened Grace. The fear of losing Ethan's small world pushed her bones into a new stance. She started a notebook labeled Evidence, a small, clumsy captain's log of receipts, times, witness names. She scraped together savings, sold a pair of boots, and even posted a tentative plea in a local community forum asking if anyone had footage from a night. The reply came in dribs and drabs, one person offering a short clip, another a message of moral support. The nettle of community stung less than isolation. Impartial voice, the path forward was not linear. Each action made other moves possible and closed different doors. Grace, with the stubbornness of someone who had kept a child warm through hard winters, chose to step into the legal light despite the costs. What she could not yet know was which loyalties would bend toward her and which would fracture further. The coming days would be measured in small victories and sharp tests. A witness who might change their mind, a manager's testimony, a transfer recorded or denied. The scale of asymmetry was clear, but so was Grace's decision. Fight for now, because the alternative was silence. The room smelled of paper and coffee, and something sharp that people called attention to. It was a municipal hearing room borrowed for the day, like a stage dressed for trial. Fluorescent lights flattened faces into honest planes. Cameras pushed forward on tripods like black beetles. Grace stood near the front with Marcus at her side, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles hurt. Her chest was a tight drum. Ethan's folded picture was in her mind, warming her like a small fire. From an impartial angle, these rooms were designed to make truth look formal. There were folders stacked on the long table, statements, printouts, a thumb drive labeled with small, neat handwriting. Charles Whitmore sat across from Oliver and a cluster of corporate counsel, immaculate and calm. He had the posture of a man who believed process would spare him. Oliver looked thinner than usual. Promotions and favors had not been kind to him the way thrift is kind. Laura sat to the side, with her hands folded in her lap, eyes red as if she had been running through regrets. Empathetic voice. Grace felt the heat in the room as if the light itself. Now those small things gathered like thunder. She wanted to tell the room about pancakes and drawings and the sound of Ethan saying "Mom" in the morning. Instead, she let Marcus speak first, his voice steady, folding facts into a narrative that sounded like armor. Marcus put the first folder on the table and slid a slim laptop toward the panel. "We have CCTV footage," he said. The phrase glittered like a promise. He had arranged for an independent copy the night before, quiet work done by someone who believed in small justice. He described the clip, time-stamped, unedited, and then he pressed play. From the impartial view, a grainy recording filled the screen. It showed the restaurant from above, a river of light and movement. For a long moment, nothing dramatic happened. People moved, servers weaved. Then, the camera focused on the corner table where Charles sat. He lifted his phone and spoke, the angle poor, but his gestures clear. Oliver crossed from the host stand, face tightened. The footage showed Charles leaning in, speaking low. His hand pointed, a simple directive. Oliver's shoulders hunched in a way that read like obedience. A moment later, Oliver moved toward Grace, his expression folded into an official mask. Empathetic voice. Grace watched it and felt a sound rise in her throat like a trapped bird. The footage showed the thing she had always feared, the whispered ordering of a fate. It was worse and better than she had imagined. The room seemed to tilt as viewers registered the scene. Charles's face, in a close-up, was not an empire. It was ordinary, small, and cunning. He had made a little decision in private, and then watched that decision shape a life. Oliver tried to speak first, voice clipped. "Context," he said, and then faltered. He had rehearsed protective phrases, but the screen kept running. The camera recorded not only his walk, but a sliver of another moment. A handshake in the alley outside, a quick exchange that in the noiseless footage read like payment. Marcus had the timestamps. He laid them out. Transfers, messages, the same pattern Grace had discovered on Laura's phone, but broader. Oliver had not simply been grateful, he had been contracted. From the impartial, the boardroom murmur rose. Corporate counsel reached for papers. Charles's jaw tightened. When the public sees a pattern, it can become a verdict in the court of the moment. Oliver's defenses thinned as Marcus pressed harder, connecting threads. Laura's small transfers, Oliver's loan months earlier, a recorded voice note where manager thanked C for helping them with staffing concerns. Each piece snapped into a web. Empathetic voice, the human sound in the room changed when Laura stood up. Her legs shook. Grace could see every choice weigh on her in the way the woman's hands trembled. "I'm sorry," Laura said. Words can be small, but they can cut in their rightness. She told the truth about the money, about being frightened about her own bills, and about a meeting she had not wanted to attend. She said she had been told it would be small, nothing to change lives, and that she had not believed what it would cost her friendship. Her apology fell like rain. Grace felt something break and something else open. Charles rose, the picture of a man who wanted to close this like a window. "This is manipulation," he said, voice even. "I am a businessman." The claim hung in the air, brittle. Marcus did not let it stand. He clicked a second file, an audio recording of a call between Charles and an associate that matched the gestures on the CCTV. The recording named Grace as the person to be handled. The word was clinical and ugly. The room exhaled as one. From the impartial view, when a man who had believed himself above consequence heard his own voice calling for removal, the rhetoric faltered. Oliver's face crumpled. He could not hold the lines he had practiced. Under pressure, his pride failed. He began, and then the years of favors and the fear of losing promotion and the sight of money stacked as safety unspooled. He confessed in fits and starts, naming meetings, admitting the transfers, saying the words, "I was scared," in a voice that did not absolve him but explained him. Empathetic voice. Grace watched Oliver's confession like a funeral of illusions. She had wanted an account, not ruin. The sight of a man who had once called her efficient, now small and ashamed, made her feel both sorrow and relief. Charles's face had drained of color. His empire, slick polished, showed fracture lines. Reporters scribbled. The recording stopped, the light on the screen blinking like a heartbeat behind glass. Silence settled, thick and odd and full of consequences. Grace felt a quiet bloom inside her, no triumphant shout, but a deep, slow uncoiling. The truth had landed messy and imperfect. She thought of Ethan and let a small wetness fall at the corner of her eye. Outside, rain began again in a soft, steady thread, as if the city needed to wash itself clean. The hearing would not end the story. There were settlements, apologies, legal papers to write, but in that bright, fluorescent room, the axis shifted. Loyalties had broken, names had been said, and for the first time, Grace felt the shape of what could come next. The weeks after the hearing moved like weather, some days bright and quick, some days heavy with gray. Grace returned to a rhythm that felt new. Meetings with Marcus, calls with a human resources investigator, and quiet interviews with reporters who wanted a face for a story that had otherwise lived in whispers. She slept in fits at first, waking to check the small photo of Ethan as if the world needed proof she was still herself. Each morning she made pancakes because rituals mattered. They were small oaths she could keep even when larger things felt uncertain. Impartial voice, settlements are messy. Corporations calculate risk and public sentiment. Lawyers draw numbers that look like compromise. After the hearing, Whitmore Enterprises moved quickly to contain the damage. Corporate counsel offered a formal apology, a severance package, and a promise to review staffing protocols. Oliver was suspended and later dismissed. Charles Whitmore stepped away from day-to-day operations pending an internal review, though his public statement framed his actions as misjudgments rather than malice. Legally, many wounds are patched with signatures and checks. Morally, the work of repair moves slower. Empathetic voice. Grace signed the papers with hands that did not shake as much as she expected. The money in the envelope would pay a rent arrear and buy a reliable winter coat for Ethan. It would not refill all the months she had spent balancing bills, nor would it erase the way her trust had been tested. She felt both lightness and heaviness, relief that the immediate threat to home and health had been eased, and sorrow that justice often wore the face of negotiation. Marcus told her the settlement was strong enough to give them room to breathe. He also said it allowed the company to avoid years of litigation that might have left her drained. Impartial voice. Public apologies have power and limits. The company instituted new training and promised an anonymous reporting line. These changes mattered to some employees. For others, they were procedural. The press coverage gave the issue visibility, and for a moment the restaurant's dining room felt different. The staff spoke with an extra care in the back rooms, and managers were watched with a keener eye. Yet systems resist change, and without continued pressure, policies can slide back into old habits. Empathetic voice. Laura came by one afternoon with hands awkwardly empty. She had lost shifts and a little of herself in the weeks since the hearing. Grace met her in the small park across from the bakery where they had once joked about late-night bread. They sit with the same distance two people keep when they are not sure what remains between them. Laura's apology was quiet and honest. "I thought I was protecting my life," she said. "I was wrong." Grace listened and felt all the sharp pieces, anger, loneliness, pity, crowd the space under her ribs. Forgiveness was not a single motion, it was something that might be built or refused over time. Impartial voice. Rebuilding trust is a negotiation with time. Laura's employment prospects were bruised. She had to answer questions that she had not known how to face. For Grace, the choice to keep Laura in a small orbit of her life was strategic as well as human. Testimony and truth were both needed. Compassion could coexist with accountability. The legal record kept Laura's admission. The social record kept her face. Both mattered in different ways. Empathetic voice. There were moments when Grace imagined the scene at the hearing and felt a small, fierce pride. She was not the woman who had been made small by a single command. She had stood and let a public room hold the truth. The cost was not nothing. Late nights, the strain of reputation, the fatigue of being seen in pieces. But the outcome had a new shape, security for Ethan for a while, and a credibility that had not been hers to begin with. She walked differently because the work had taught her where her edges were and how to defend them. Impartial voice. The aftermath rippled beyond the immediate players. The restaurant chain saw a slight dip in local patronage and then a slow return as new management tried to rebrand. Other workers in the city watched, and for some, the case became a lesson in leverage, that small acts could attract attention, and that attention could force institutions to account. Policy shifts were proposed at a municipal level, mandatory reporting channels, and clearer definitions of acceptable grounds for firing. Systems moved. Whether they moved enough was a question left to time. Empathetic voice. At home, Grace folded laundry with a new economy of care. Ethan chased light across the living room and called her to see shapes in clouds. Their life was still ordinary in the most important ways: bedtime stories, pancakes, a crooked drawing pinned to the fridge. But Grace carried in her pocket a different kind of currency, knowledge that she could act, that she could hold people to account without losing herself entirely. That knowledge was a slow-burning courage that would not solve every future bill, but it would change how she spoke and how she planned. Impartial voice, yet the moral questions lingered. The settlement brought safety, but also allowed structural harms to persist in many places. The apology acknowledged wrongdoing but did not, in itself, erase the mechanisms that made the abuse possible. For systemic change to endure, individual victories must seed collective shifts, policies oversight, and a culture that prizes dignity over convenience. Empathetic voice. Grace thought of mercy and justice as objects she held in one hand each. Sometimes mercy felt like warmth, sometimes like a compromise. Justice felt like a steady light, but also like something that could harden into a ritual without meaning. Her choice was to hold both and to use them as tools. She used part of the settlement to start a small fund for other workers needing legal help, a tiny thing at first but honest in intent. She met with a neighborhood organizer and lent her voice at a city meeting, not out of vengeance, but out of a desire that the next person not stand alone. Final thought, quietly honest. On the last evening before school started again, Grace and Ethan walked beneath a sky, washed clean by rain. The city lights hummed warm and ordinary. Grace bent to tie his shoe and felt the small, steady pulse of being needed. She had sought restitution and found a way to pay forward what she had been given. She had been betrayed and had found a way through it that kept some of her soft parts intact. In the end, she thought truth had a cost, but so did silence. She chose the cost she could live with. And in that strange arithmetic, she found a kind of peace. If you found this story powerful, make sure to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Your support helps us bring more important stories to light.